The Seahawks clearly saw something they didn't like, and instead of waiting around and hoping things would improve, they decided to act. And trust me, there's a lot to unpack here because this could have some very interesting consequences moving forward. So hit that like button right now. And before we get into the details, drop your first reaction in the comments. Do you like seeing the Seahawks being aggressive and making moves this quickly? The Seattle Seahawks are signing former Pro Bowl and All-Pro cornerback Trevon Diggs, and the timing of this move says a lot about how Seattle currently views the depth of its secondary. According to the information presented by NFL insider Jordan Schultz, Seattle is adding Diggs after bringing him in for a workout, turning what had been a possibility into an actual move for a veteran cornerback who has already shown that he can perform at an extremely high level. Diggs is still only 27 years old, which immediately makes this situation interesting. Seattle is not simply bringing in an aging veteran at the very end of his career and hoping he has something left. The Seahawks are taking a chance on a player who has experienced major success in the NFL but whose more recent seasons have been affected by significant injuries. That history creates the central question surrounding this signing. How much of the player who once reached an All-Pro level is still there? The Seahawks apparently believe there is enough upside to find out. Diggs' 2021 season represents the level that made his name around the league. The material describes him as an All-Pro that year, producing a large number of tackles while making life extremely difficult for opposing passing attacks. Most importantly, he generated interceptions at an exceptional rate and even turned some of those opportunities into touchdowns. That version of Diggs was a major playmaker, but Seattle does not necessarily need to recover that exact version of him for this signing to work. That distinction matters because the past few years have been much more complicated for Diggs. Injuries have caused him to miss substantial time, and those absences have affected both his performance and the way other teams have viewed him. The player Seattle is getting cannot simply be evaluated by looking at the best season of his career and assuming that production will automatically return. There is risk here, and nothing about the signing guarantees that Diggs will suddenly become an All-Pro again. At the same time, that is precisely why this move can be viewed as a low-risk, high-reward opportunity. The expectation presented is that Diggs will be coming to Seattle on a smaller contract. If he stays healthy and becomes a productive part of the secondary, the Seahawks could end up receiving tremendous value. If he cannot help the secondary, Seattle can move on and essentially return to the situation it was already facing. And that situation is what makes this signing so important. Seattle's first preseason game against the Dallas Cowboys raised concerns about the cornerback room, particularly when some of the team's more established options were not on the field. The assessment coming out of that performance was not simply that one young player had a bad game. The larger concern was whether Seattle had enough trustworthy depth behind its top options if injuries forced the coaching staff further down the roster. The source specifically points to Devin Witherspoon and Josh Jobe as players whose availability matters significantly to this group, while Noah Igbinoghene and Nehemiah Pritchett were among the few other options that inspired some confidence. The rookies, however, did not perform at the level that had been hoped for in that preseason opportunity. That does not mean Seattle has given up on those young players. There is still confidence expressed in Mike Macdonald and his defensive coaching staff to develop them. A rookie struggling now does not mean that player cannot eventually become useful, but Seattle apparently does not want to depend entirely on development when it needs reliable depth immediately. The Seahawks have already had OTAs, minicamp, and a significant portion of training camp to evaluate this room. Now they are acting. That is where Diggs changes the equation. Instead of asking inexperienced players to immediately become dependable depth pieces, Seattle can put a veteran into the competition who has already played at the highest level. Diggs knows what NFL football requires, and if he can stay healthy, he gives the Seahawks another legitimate option for what was described as the third cornerback spot. John Schneider's willingness to keep upgrading this position is becoming particularly clear. Seattle is not treating the roster as finished simply because training camp is underway. If Schneider sees an opportunity to improve a position that appears vulnerable, he is willing to make another move. The same applies to Macdonald. Based on the material, the coaching staff is not going to ignore a weakness just because younger players are already in the building. And Diggs is not the only recent development at cornerback. Seattle had also announced its intention to sign Terrion Arnold, creating an important question about what the Diggs move means for Arnold. At first glance, adding Diggs could easily create the impression that the Seahawks have changed their plans. According to the information provided, however, that is not what is happening. The Seahawks have not completely moved on from Arnold. ESPN's Adam Schefter is cited as saying Seattle is still planning to sign him. The complication is that Arnold is expected to go on the commissioner's exempt list, which means the immediate situation is different from what Seattle originally hoped for. The hope had been that Arnold could participate during the preseason and potentially get onto the field relatively quickly. That now does not appear to be possible. Diggs, meanwhile, provides something Seattle needs right now: availability to begin working and practicing with the team. That makes the sequence of these moves much easier to understand. Signing Diggs does not necessarily replace the plan involving Arnold. Instead, Seattle is addressing an immediate need, while apparently maintaining its longer-term intention to add Arnold as well. The expectation presented is that Arnold's signing could happen later, after the preseason games. There was even speculation in the source that Diggs could potentially appear by Seattle's third preseason game, although the turnaround before the matchup against the Titans was acknowledged as extremely quick. Nothing guarantees that will happen. What matters more is that Diggs can enter the building and begin working immediately rather than leaving Seattle waiting for another option to become available. There is also some familiarity within the Seahawks' defensive operation. Diggs previously crossed paths in Dallas with Aiden Durdy, who is now part of Seattle's coaching staff, and the material also mentions DeMarcus Lawrence and Dante Fowler Jr. as part of that connection. For a veteran joining a new team at this stage, that existing familiarity could at least give Seattle a clearer understanding of the player it is bringing into the building. But the biggest factor remains health. If Diggs cannot stay on the field, everything else becomes secondary. His recent injury history is the reason there are questions surrounding him in the first place. It is also why expecting the 2021 All-Pro version immediately would be unrealistic based on the information we have. Seattle does not need to make that bet. It needs Diggs to become a reliable, productive veteran option who strengthens a room that looked too thin when its top players were unavailable. If that happens, this could become one of those moves that looks much better with time than it did on the day it was announced. If it does not, Seattle has still demonstrated that it recognizes the weakness and is actively trying to correct it, rather than simply hoping its young cornerbacks develop quickly enough. And there is another layer to this story, because adding Diggs, while still planning to bring in Terrion Arnold, could dramatically change the competition and depth inside this cornerback room. So, what do you think, Seahawks fans? Does signing Trevon Diggs give you confidence that Seattle has found the veteran help this secondary needed? Or are his recent injuries still too big of a concern? If you enjoyed this update, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss anything happening with the Seahawks. And before you leave, click the video on your screen right now to keep up with the latest Seattle news. The biggest Seahawks updates, as soon as they happen, you'll find them right here.